14 October 1942. Inside the ruined shell of what was once the Barricadi gun factory, a young Red Army soldier presses himself flat against a mound of shattered brick as a German grenade skitters past his boot. Somewhere above him, on the second floor of a building that no longer has a second floor, another man waits with a sharpened spade in one hand and a submachine gun slung across his back. Neither of them can see more than 3 meters in any direction. The dust has not settled here in weeks. This is not open battle, not the sweeping tank charges and grand maneuvers that had defined the war so far. This is something else entirely. A war fought room by room, floor by floor, in a city that has already been reduced to rubble and bone. The Germans call it Rattenkrieg, the Rats' War. And in this Rats' War, the Red Army is quietly building something that will not just help it survive Stalingrad, but will help it win. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what Stalingrad had become by October 1942. A city of 500,000 people had been bombed into a moonscape within days of the German assault beginning in late August. The Luftwaffe had flown over 1,600 sorties in a single 24-hour period, dropping incendiaries that turned wooden districts into firestorms visible from 50 kilometers away. What remained was not a city in any conventional sense. It was a labyrinth of collapsed masonry, twisted girders, half-standing stairwells, and cellars that connected to nothing and everything. Traditional Soviet infantry doctrine, built around large formations, advancing across open ground with artillery support, was worse than useless here. It got men killed for meters of rubble that meant nothing. Something had to change, and it had to change fast, because behind the Soviet defenders was the Volga River, and behind the Volga there was nowhere left to retreat to. This is the story of how a handful of desperate, improvised ideas, dismissed at first as too small and too strange to matter, became the tactical backbone that broke the German Sixth Army, and why the man who championed them was almost sidelined before anyone believed he was right. Stalingrad had not always been a military prize of the first order. Before the summer of 1942, it was, above all, an industrial city, home to the vast Barricadi arms works, the Krasny Oktyabr steel plant, and the Stalingrad tractor factory, which had been hurriedly converted to build T-34 tanks. It sat along the western bank of the Volga, a river that carried a substantial share of Soviet oil traffic north from the Caucasus fields, and it bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, a fact that would come to matter enormously to both Hitler and Stalin as the battle dragged on, and neither man could countenance losing a city that carried such symbolic weight. What began as a secondary objective within the wider summer offensive, Case Blue, aimed principally at seizing the oil fields further south, hardened by late August into an obsession on both sides that the city could not be allowed to fall into the other's hands. That obsession is part of why the fighting became so absolute, so unwilling to yield even a single building without a fight to the death. By the 4th week of the siege, the Soviet 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov was in a position that should, by any conventional military logic, have been hopeless. His forces held a thin, broken strip of the city's western bank, in places barely 200 meters deep, with the Volga at their backs and no real prospect of large-scale retreat. Reinforcements had to cross the river at night under constant artillery and air bombardment, and casualty rates among the boats making that crossing sometimes exceeded 50%. Conventional Red Army doctrine at this stage of the war still leaned heavily on the lessons of 1941 and early 1942. Mass infantry assaults, coordinated with artillery barrages, moving across relatively open terrain to seize and hold ground. That doctrine had already failed catastrophically once in the opening weeks of the German invasion, when entire Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed by exactly the kind of large-scale maneuver warfare the Wehrmacht excelled at.
Stalingrad made the problem worse, not better. The city's ruined geography neutralized German tank superiority, which was a small mercy, but it did the same to any Soviet attempt at coordinated large-unit movement. Artillery observers on both sides struggled to see more than a building or two ahead. Radio communication broke down constantly amid the concrete and steel. Soviet commanders were losing men not to a lack of courage, but to a lack of any tactical framework suited to fighting inside a shattered industrial city. Estimates suggest that in the early weeks of the urban battle, some Soviet units suffered casualty rates above 70% within days of being committed to the fighting, gains measured in single rooms rather than kilometers. Meanwhile, German commanders, confident from 2 years of maneuver warfare success, continued to push forward with combined arms assaults that assumed they were still fighting the war of open steppe and rolling tank columns. Both sides, in other words, were trying to fight a battle that no longer resembled anything either army had trained for. Whoever adapted first would hold a decisive advantage, and the man who saw this most clearly was not a general staff theorist working from a map table in Moscow, but Chuikov himself, watching his own men die for ground that could not be held the old way. Chuikov had taken command of the 62nd Army only in mid-September 1942, arriving to find an army already bled white by weeks of costly conventional counterattacks. He was, by most accounts, a blunt and unsentimental commander, unwilling to indulge in the kind of theoretical debate that so often slowed Red Army decision-making earlier in the war. What he grasped quickly, and what took some of his more traditionally minded subordinates longer to accept, was that the ordinary chain of command, large formations maneuvering on the orders of distant staff officers reading maps that no longer bore any resemblance to the shattered ground below, simply could not function inside a city reduced to this state. Decisions had to be pushed downward to sergeants and junior lieutenants who could see and smell and hear the building in front of them. That decentralization, as much as any single weapon or tactic, was the real revolution, and it ran directly against the grain of a military culture that had, in the terrible purges and reorganizations of the preceding years, often punished initiative rather than rewarded it. The answer that emerged from the wreckage was the Stormovaya Gruppe, the Storm Group, and it is worth naming the officers and engineers who shaped it, because this was not handed down from on high, it was built from the bottom up, often against the instincts of more conservative commanders. Chuikov, working with divisional commanders including Alexander Rodimtsev of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, began organizing small, self-contained assault teams, typically 6 to 8 men, sometimes as few as 3 or 4, built around a core of submachine gunners, grenadiers, combat engineers, and a sniper or two, with heavier support elements held close behind. The logic was almost the opposite of everything Soviet infantry manuals had preached. Instead of a broad front advancing together, small teams would infiltrate at night through cellars, sewers, and blown-out walls, avoiding open streets entirely, and clear buildings from the inside out, cellar to ground floor to first floor, room by room, using grenades thrown ahead and short bursts of automatic fire rather than sustained exchanges.
The weapon that made this possible, more than any other single piece of equipment, was the PPSH-41 submachine gun, and it is worth pausing on its design because it explains so much about why the storm groups worked. The PPSH was not an elegant weapon. It was stamped and pressed sheet steel, produced by workers with minimal machining skill in factories that had, in many cases, been dismantled in Moscow or Leningrad and rebuilt from scratch beyond the Ural Mountains, safely out of range of German bombers. It weighed roughly 3.6 kilograms loaded, fed from a 71-round drum magazine about the size of a large tin of paint and fired at a rate approaching 900 rounds a minute, nearly double that of the German MP-40 it faced across the rubble. In the confines of a stairwell or a cellar corridor, where an engagement might last 2 or 3 seconds and happen at a range of 5 meters or less, that rate of fire was not a statistic, it was survival. A soldier bursting through a doorway with a PPSH could put more lead into a room in a single trigger pull than a German squad armed with bolt-action Mauser rifles could manage in return. Soviet industry, relocated eastward in one of the most extraordinary logistical operations of the entire war, produced the PPSH in numbers that dwarfed anything the Germans could match. By some estimates, over 5 million would be manufactured before the war's end, though exact production figures for individual factories in this period remain incomplete, scattered across archives that were never fully consolidated. What mattered on the ground in Stalingrad was simpler. There were enough of them, they were reliable enough even when filled with brick dust and frozen mud, and they turned a handful of ordinary conscripts into something capable of clearing a building held by a numerically superior, better-trained German garrison. Alongside the submachine gun came the sapper, or combat engineer, whose job was just as vital and considerably less glamorous. Storm groups relied on engineers to blow holes directly through internal walls between buildings, so that assault teams could move from structure to structure without ever stepping into a street that German machine gunners and snipers had turned into a killing ground. A charge no larger than a loaf of bread, packed with a few hundred grams of explosive, could open a man-sized breach in a brick wall in seconds, roughly the force of a car door being slammed, magnified many times over, and concentrated into a single point. This meant Soviet troops effectively tunneled through entire city blocks, appearing inside buildings the Germans believed were secure, attacking from directions no conventional defense had anticipated. Grenades did the rest, thrown first into any room before troops entered it, a discipline drilled into every storm group member because hesitation in that half-second before entry was more often than not fatal. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It would be wrong to suggest the Germans had no answer of their own. Wehrmacht units developed their own close-quarters techniques during the battle, and German troops were on average better trained in small unit tactics at the war's outset than their Soviet counterparts. But German doctrine remained tied to the assumption that combined arms, tanks, artillery, and infantry working in concert would eventually break any defensive line, and Stalingrad's terrain punished that assumption relentlessly. German tanks, invaluable on open ground, became liabilities in streets choked with rubble, vulnerable to Soviet troops dropping improvised explosives from windows 2 floors above, out of reach of the tank's main gun. American and British forces fighting in far more open terrain in North Africa during the same period had little comparable experience to draw on. Urban combat on this scale and duration simply had no real precedent in the Western Allied campaigns of 1942. It would take the fighting in cities such as Aachen and later Berlin itself in 1944 and 1945 for Western armies to develop anything resembling the storm group's disciplined, small-unit infiltration approach. And by then, Soviet commanders who had survived Stalingrad were already training a new generation of officers in exactly these methods, treating the lessons of the ruined factory districts as a formal, teachable doctrine rather than an improvised desperation measure.
The German equivalent, insofar as one existed, tended to be improvised at the level of individual pioneer companies rather than driven from above as coherent doctrine. German assault engineers, the Sturmpioniere, were highly capable and had, in fact, pioneered close-quarters demolition tactics of their own during the fighting in France in 1940,
But by late 1942, the Sixth Army's pioneer battalions had themselves suffered heavy losses, and replacements arriving from Germany simply lacked the specialist training their predecessors had carried into the campaign. Where the Red Army was, in effect, building an entire army's worth of improvised combat engineers out of ordinary riflemen and factory workers with a few days of hurried instruction, German commanders were trying to stretch an ever-thinning cadre of true specialists across an ever-widening, ever more desperate perimeter. The contrast in available manpower alone, with the Soviets able to draw on a city's worth of civilians and reinforcements ferried nightly across the Volga, told against the Germans as the weeks wore on. The psychological impact on German soldiers, recorded in letters home and in post-war memoirs by surviving officers, was profound and is well documented, even where precise operational statistics from the Soviet side remain incomplete or classified to this day. German troops began referring to the fighting for individual buildings using names that reflected sheer exhaustion and dread. The fight for one apartment block near the Volga became known among German soldiers simply as the House of Sergeant Pavlov, held for some 58 days by a Soviet platoon under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, using precisely the storm group principles of fortified strongpoints connected by tunneled passages, resisting repeated assaults by a vastly larger German force. Soldiers of the Sixth Army began speaking of a war with no front line at all, where the enemy could appear from a cellar, a sewer grate, or a hole punched through a wall that had been solid an hour before. That psychological toll compounded through the autumn and into the brutal winter of 1942 into 1943, as German forces found themselves increasingly encircled, exhausted, and cut off from resupply, a strategic collapse that owed a great deal to the tactical stalemate the storm groups had first forced inside the city itself. None of this happened without immense cost, and it would be dishonest to frame the storm group tactic as some clean, elegant solution. Casualties among storm group members remained extraordinarily high throughout the battle. These were, by design, small teams operating at point-blank range against a determined enemy, and many groups were replaced entirely, sometimes more than once, as the fighting for a single building dragged on for days or weeks. The famous Pavlov's house garrison itself suffered losses that varied through its long defense, with replacements rotated in as the siege continued. What made the tactic decisive was not that it was safe, but that it worked, buying the Soviet 62nd Army the narrow margin of time and ground it needed to survive on the western bank of the Volga until the wider strategic picture shifted in November 1942, when Operation Uranus encircled the entire German Sixth Army in a pincer movement far beyond the city itself. The storm groups did not win Stalingrad on their own, but without them, there may have been no city left to encircle an army around. The legacy of these tactics reached far beyond the Volga. Soviet military doctrine through the rest of the war and well into the Cold War era retained the storm group concept as a formal element of urban warfare training, refined and taught at institutions including the Frunze Military Academy. Surviving examples of the PPSH-41 that armed those teams can today be found in museum collections across the former Soviet Union, including the Stalingrad Battle Panorama Museum in modern Volgograd, built on ground that was fought over meter by meter in the winter of 1942. The ruins of the Grudinen Mill, deliberately left unrepaired as a memorial, still stand pockmarked with shell fire near that same museum, a physical record of exactly the kind of building-to-building fighting that forced Soviet tactics to evolve or die trying.
Historians continue to debate exactly how much credit the storm group tactic deserves relative to the broader strategic encirclement of Operation Uranus, and that debate is unlikely ever to be fully settled, given how much documentation from the Soviet side was lost, destroyed, or simply never properly cataloged amid the chaos of the wider war.
What is not seriously disputed is that without the 62nd Army holding its narrow strip of riverbank through September, October, and into November 1942, there would have been no city left to encircle an army around in the first place. The storm groups bought time with blood, room by room, and time was the one resource the wider Soviet counter-offensive could not have done without. Return for a moment to that soldier pressed against the brick, waiting with his spade and his submachine gun on the second floor of a building with no second floor. He did not know in that instant that the tactic keeping him alive would be studied in military academies for decades afterwards, or that the city crumbling around him would become the single most costly battle in human history, with combined casualties on both sides that some historians place well above 1 million, though, as with so much of this battle, precise figures remain disputed and incomplete even now. He knew only the room ahead of him, the grenade in his hand, and the 3 seconds it would take to clear it. Multiply that room by 10,000, by 100,000, across a city ground down to brick dust over 5 months of siege, and you begin to understand how Stalingrad was actually won. Not by a single weapon, not by a single general's brilliance, but by small groups of frightened, exhausted men who adapted faster than their enemy did, room by room, wall by wall, until the war's momentum itself had shifted beneath their feet. The Germans called it the Rats' War. History remembers it as the turning point of the Second World War in Europe, and it was built, quite literally, out of rubble, desperation, and the stubborn refusal of a handful of soldiers to fight the old war any longer.